Hello, and thank you again for joining us on our talent podcast with myself, Amy Milner, and Sam Clegg. Our
Hi.
podcast is aimed at breaking down our rethink mindset capabilities, bringing you real life examples of their importance, plus tips and tricks of how you can help to develop in them. We hope you enjoy each episode, but as always, if there's anything you'd like to hear more about, please don't hesitate to get in touch with either of us.
Thanks, Amy. Hi, everyone. So today we've got two really special guests joining us on the podcast. We have got Nikki Jones, our head of DE&I from Konica Minolta US, and Gemma Lee, our chief people officer from Konica Minolta UK. So Amy and I are really excited to have both of these people joining us. This podcast episode is going to break down our rethink mindset capability of embracing diversity. It's come at a perfect time. It's fantastic because we are actually in the middle of celebrating Black History Month in the UK. And we've also just seen World Mental Health Day this month as well on the 10th of October. Within BGB, we've defined this capability as someone who embraces and leverages the differences in people in an inclusive way. And today we're going to be covering some topics such as how to be a better ally to enhance diversity and create an inclusive workplace, as well as the importance of a diverse workforce and how leaders themselves can be more inclusive. So I would love to move over to Gemma and Nikki to say hi. And I suppose, Gemma and Nikki, what would be wonderful if you could just kind of let us know to, I suppose, frame this episode. I suppose, what does inclusion mean to you? Nikki, can we go to you first?
Sure, absolutely. First, thank you for inviting me to the podcast. I'm so happy to be here. This is such an important topic. So very glad to join this conversation with you. Yeah, so regarding inclusion and what that means to me, at the root of inclusion, it's really about trust and respect. And for me, in the workplace, that means I can be myself, right? I can show up and I can comfortably be myself and know that I will be accepted, and I can feel good about that. So that's what inclusion means to me. It's about trust, it's about respect, and just really being myself and feeling comfortable in my own skin.
Brilliant. I love that.
I would second a lot of that. Firstly, thank you so much for having me. I've been really excited listening to all of the podcasts that you've recorded today and bringing these rethink capabilities to life. Obviously, this topic in particular is one that I'm extremely passionate about and connected to, and hoping to drive through our UK and our global organisation. I completely agree with Nikki. For me, inclusion is about being trusted as well, about being valued for who you are and what you bring into conversations and ways of working. And being truly included means that you are accepted for who you are and what it is that you're contributing. And that for me is truly about being included.
Brilliant. Yeah, that makes total sense. Amy, I'm actually quite intrigued to know what it means to you as well, because I know we have a conversation about this quite a lot. So I'm really enjoying hearing all these different kind of meanings of what it actually truly means to yourself. Do you want to let us know what it means to you, just to quickly interlude?
For me, I think it's just around particularly authenticity, I think is the real key thing for me. So being able to show up to work and be your true authentic self in an environment that embraces that. And I think an environment as well that encourages and harnesses it. So opportunities where you might be falling out of that authenticity, having the people around you that can kind of potentially call that out a little bit, I think is for me is inclusion. It's kind of the people that kind of build up the culture around that for me.
Absolutely. I think that's a really, really good point, actually. And I'd like to kind of hone in a little bit, actually, with both Nikki and Gemma around this, in terms of when Amy was saying that, it's about kind of, I suppose, the people and kind of what we do as an organisation to make people feel included. Is there a place, I suppose, to Nikki and Gemma that you've kind of felt truly included? I mean, it might not be at Konica Minolta, it could be at Konica Minolta. And I suppose my question for you is, why do you think that was?
I think, shall I go first there? I think for me, the interesting thing, and it's made me think when you've all been talking as well, in that to truly understand inclusion, I think you potentially have to have felt exclusion, so understood when you didn't feel included or fit, and how different that feels. And I think when I thought about the question of when have I felt most included, I would say that sometimes it's in the spaces I wouldn't expect, because potentially they've been spaces I've felt excluded in historically. So in other environments, when maybe I have felt excluded, to then have a similar environment where the people in my mind I might have expected to have behaved in the same way didn't, and therefore it's a real known feeling of that inclusion, if that makes sense. So it's almost like a very notable road test of that, in that as a woman, there's been lots of environments I've been in through many years, both in education and in the workplace, where inclusion hasn't always been something that's felt readily or easily, and you've felt the opposite. So to be in spaces, the same type of spaces, so in a work environment as an example, where that inclusion is there, and to experience that when you haven't historically, can also be a very powerful difference. And I think that's the really important part of that inclusive workplace, and the main difference being how much that then brings out your confidence, your value adds, and your voice. And so for me, inclusion is most felt in a variety of places, dependent on how others treat you, I suppose would be the point. It's about the people. I don't know what you think, Nikki, but that makes a big difference for me.
Absolutely. I love the way you framed that, Gemma. I wanna pick up on that and then share a very specific example from my career, just to sort of illuminate the framework that you laid out. So when I think about early in my career, I was in sales and product marketing, and so I was very accustomed to tailoring my message to the audience, right? Like that's marketing and sales 101. Making sure the message will resonate. And I remember very clearly my manager at the time, when I was a marketing manager, saying to me, Nikki, you're doing a great job, but I want you to make sure that you're paying attention to the relationships with your colleagues. And he went on to say, and I also want you to, and these were his words, not remix yourself. Not remix yourself when connecting with colleagues. And when I thought about that, what he was trying to tell me is, don't put on a mask, right, to fit in. Don't do or say the things that you think will garner that acceptance, right? Just be yourself. Be yourself and you'll be fine. Tell your story and you'll be fine. And I took that advice, and my relationships with my colleagues went to the next level in so many ways, and we collaborated and had some great success from a sales and marketing standpoint. And I've continued to follow that advice throughout my career. So the many places that my career has gone, the companies and that I've worked with, and the people that I've worked with, I always try to show up as my authentic self everywhere and not be ashamed about that. Now, to Gemma's point, that doesn't mean that it's always received.
I was just about to say that.
Yes, that it's always received. But what I would say to people listening out there, if, for instance, you're interviewing with a company and you're seeing or feeling that your message isn't being received, take that as a flag, right? Interrogate that more. If you're feeling as though with your current teams that you're just not quite making that connection, use it as an opportunity to reflect and show up as your authentic self. Don't hold back. So I just that has been a really, really important piece of advice that I've followed for many years now. And I think if more of us could do that, including leaders, if more of us could commit to authenticity, as Amy said at the top of the call, our culture would just flourish and thrive in ways unseen.
I think I think it's a fantastic point. I remember similarly someone gave me advice about if you're not valued at the table you're sitting at, go and sit at a new table. And I think that is really similar in that sense around not always questioning why you don't fit, but also thinking about why the environment doesn't fit you. Because that feeling is something to trust. Certainly as you develop through your career and understand yourself better, and what you need from a culture and an organization, and that's to value how you fit into it as well.
Mm,
Yeah, this
definitely.
is great.
I love don't remix yourself. That is
Mm.
such a great line. That's going to stick with me, Nikki, 100%. And I think what you both said is so valid. I'd be interested to hear from both of you, actually, with both of your advice that you've had. Any advice for people out there that might struggle? Because that's quite scary, isn't it? To kind of stand up and really be yourself and not wear a mask. It can be quite frightening. And I imagine, especially for people kind of in early careers. I mean, how have you both done that? I know we're slightly going off on a tangent here, Amy, but I think this would be really useful for people to kind of to hear from both Gemma and Nikki. Kind of any kind of advice that you could say about being more authentic.
Definitely. And I think just whilst thinking about that question too, I think to both of your points around, move tables or, kind of read the room or the feedback that you're getting if people aren't embracing your authentic self, that's quite a lot to take on, isn't it, in terms of potential knockbacks. So I think just thinking about that from that question as well would be really interesting.
I think for me, and I would guess that Nikki's probably got a similar example as well, in that a lot of value I found with developing that was around understanding myself better and also understanding other people. So I think that there's not enough that could be said about developing your own self-awareness, but also listening to other people. So I'm going to quote my mother now, but a very good example I used to often discuss with my mum after school would be, if one person thinks something, maybe that's not the case, but maybe if 5 people did think you behaved a certain way or something wasn't great, that might be something more to listen to. And I think the main point of that was that you are constantly in life surrounded by people that want to give you feedback, often unsolicited advice. And but you can understand what you need to from paying attention to other social signals and signs, and they will often give you a good indication. And not to step on that point, but in some environments they may give you all the indication of the things that you don't need to amend and change about yourself, but there will also be examples where there are certain things that you're doing that maybe don't work for others. I mean, Nikki mentioned just a minute ago about having to think about your messaging and your story and how you sell. That's also a consideration for yourself, because if you want to work well with others or influence or have impact, certainly as a leader, it's more about the people you lead than it ever is yourself. So it's really important to understand yourself as you develop in your career, but it's also really important to pay attention to those around you as well. And I think if you combine those together, that development and confidence will come.
That's a home run point. And the thing that I would add to that is, for us, right, having this conversation, we're people and culture leaders, right, within the organization. I think it's really important, the role that we play, right, in terms of coaching executives and hiring managers to be inclusive, right, pointing out those behaviors that do in fact support a very inclusive culture, but also setting up those supports that we know make a difference. So and thinking about it throughout the entire employee life cycle from day one, right, until finality. Thinking about how we set up those resource groups, business resource groups in the organization, to make people feel as though they have a voice and that they belong and they're not the only, because the reality is, we are, we share a lot of diverse identities, and there's a lot of facets that that make us who we are.
Mm.
And we all bring that into the workplace each and every day. And so we want to make sure that people don't feel alone, that they do feel connected. And there's, so many ways to do that.
Definitely. I love that, Nikki, as well, because actually it's made me think, I think it's, again, Amy, this is something we talk about, actually questioning ourselves. What do we actually stand for? And I think as you go through your career and through life, I guess you start to realize that yourself more, don't you? But you can only do that by meeting different people and embracing diversity and being inclusive, and, as you say, maybe joining these ERGs or reading different things and listening to different, I don't know, podcasts and things like that. I suppose it's about really figuring out what you stand for, so then you can kind of, I suppose, embrace others. Does that make sense?
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Absolutely.
And I think a really important point on that as well is that doesn't mean that you need to surround yourself with echo chambers or people that think and act like you. In fact, so much value comes from you challenging others and you challenging yourself. But in terms of how people do that to each other when they are inclusive, for me, means that you challenge in a way that both people feel comfortable with. And I think that's really important, that it doesn't mean you can't have edgy conversations or challenge someone's leadership or direction. And for leaders that want to be considerate of the people that work for them and with them, they want to welcome that challenge and conversation. Because if you're looking all the time for everyone to agree with you, then progress is rarely made. So I think that's also something that is so important around looking for people who you can work with, but also you can sometimes find some of the most exciting self-development by having discussions with people that think entirely different to you as well. And that debate is important to both sides of that discussion. And that's something that we probably in today's world are seeing less of.
Yeah, when employees feel that too, right? Like if they feel as though they can't express an unpopular opinion, then they will keep their thoughts to themselves. And what a missed opportunity for the business, right? Because really the power of diversity is around that diversity of thought. It is around innovation and creativity. And so we need more of that. We need more new ideas to drive our business forward and to reach our potential.
Absolutely.
Exactly.
And that's kind of almost just touched on our next point, which was going to be about the importance of having a diverse workforce. And you've kind of you've named all the kind of key points for me, both Gemma and Nikki there. It's about that kind of diversity of thought, isn't it?
Sam, on that point, there's some absolutely terrifying examples of safety equipment that is tested only on male forms. And the danger that puts for women. Medical examples definitely throughout COVID time of how under-researched different ethnicities. From that perspective, I think that there is so much to do across all of the world and how we think and what we think like in order to diversify what's being developed and the impact that does or doesn't have on different people. And I think the piece for me around diversity of thought and innovation is often spoken about most in the business world from a fairly positive place about having more innovation or commercial growth. But it's actually, if you flip it the other way to some of those examples, it could be very limiting for a lot of things that have been developed historically and continue to be, without considering how different people are in the world and what that would mean for what's being developed. So it's a huge consideration of ensuring that this is happening within companies.
Definitely. And I think people are at the heart of everything. So in terms of us creating that diverse culture, it's the people that are there that can do that. And what I wanted to do was just kind of speak to you a little bit about allyship as well. So for people that feel that potentially they don't fit into a particular group, a minority group potentially, and what they could do to help. But equally, have either of you ever had a really good ally at a company that are currently working at or have worked at previously that's really helped to kind of raise the bar with the diversity agenda at all?
Well, a couple of things on that. Whenever I hear that, actually, I had an employee reach out to me recently and say, Nikki, I'm really loving all the things that you're doing. So excited. Um, I'm passionate about diversity and inclusion work, but I just don't feel as though, um, I'm in the underrepresented group or
Mm.
groups, and therefore I'm just going to sit on the sidelines.
Yeah.
And I wrote back to the person and I said, no, please. That is the exact opposite of what I want you to do. I want you to get involved. Because we need your passion, we need your voice, but B, um, there's intersectionality of our identities. So, I think when we say the word diversity, the sort of first thought in people's minds tends to be around, ethnicity or gender or right. But that's right. That's just the tip of the iceberg. There's so much more to consider. And we all have a role to play. So that's the first part. But in terms of your question around allyship, it is a big deal, right? Because I'm not a member of the LGBTQ community, for instance. However, I am a huge ally of the community, and I want to do my part to show up and support and use my voice to make my friends and colleagues more visible, and offer the support and development that they need and deserve. And so for me, I've been fortunate to have really great mentors or allies, if you will, throughout my career. I'll give you a good example, a recent one. I'm in a women's leadership development program, and it's amazing. Yes, like all of these badass women. Oh, I'm sorry, I said a curse word. Maybe you can edit, you can edit it out. All of these really ambitious women, from a range of industries, at the top of their games. And we come together really to share our experiences and to get better, right? And the topics are on a variety. They range the gamut, from how to negotiate a salary increase, or how to have an uncomfortable conversation with a direct report. And anyhow, one of my allies within the program, she's actually a past participant. She works in the diversity and inclusion space. She and I just have forged a relationship. And, I can call her and say, hey, I've had a really tough day. I pitched this proposal to the executive team. It didn't go well. Why do you think that is? Tell me what I did wrong and tell me how I can fix it. And it's just, and she doesn't work at Konica Minolta. So she's a, sort of a third party, outsider, if you will, that can offer impartial advice. And that is just, it's huge. And it's been such a value add. So I mentioned that example to say that, sometimes our allies are inside the company and sometimes they're outside the company, and we can leverage, those resources accordingly.
I would completely agree, and I think the important part is to be an ally, and also, as you said, Nikki, to encourage that in others. And I think that one of the things that I've noticed quite a lot of late, particularly in the UK, is a lot of discussion and debate about gender progression is being held by women, for women, to discuss for women. And there's a really important component part of that conversation that is the opposite gender that needs to be part of those discussions and those debates, and to show up and push forward that progression. Similarly, within the workplace, and some of the best allies I've had have been, both women and men, have been supportive of you. And I think that's the important part of showing up for an individual and being their biggest cheerleader, both in helping them grow their confidence, but also if they're in the spaces that you're not yet in, then to talk about that person there in a favorable way, and to reference them. And a lot of that is really helpful to progress people through organizations, particularly when you have fairly hierarchical structures where that really matters. But I think that the openness of everyone being part of this conversation, and this conversation being rich in diversity, is when we see true allyship and progression. If it's only the voices that need to be heard that haven't been historically talking, we're still missing the core group of people that need to potentially be the ones educated and changing as well. So I think that's the importance of allyship. You need to be wanting to show up for people and create a different future, not necessarily be that person yourself, if that makes sense.
Absolutely. And I think it's not talked about enough sometimes, to be honest, and it's such an important role to play. I think for people listening, if someone was seeking to be an ally, what would your advice be to them?
I think for me it would depend in what capacity and why. I mean, I really liked Nikki's example of how that person wanting to show connection and allyship arrived with you, Nikki. But I suppose that's a good example too of a very structured role that exists within an organization that gives that obvious touch point to it. I don't know what you think, Nikki, about maybe also how often people may be going towards a leader or a manager to hope to connect in that way.
Yeah, what I would say is that, the insight, the wisdom is in multiple places, right? So don't limit yourself to people in the company. Sure, if you want to find allies inside the company that know the business, that's great, but don't feel like that's the only place that you have to go. And then in terms of what advice would I give to an ally or someone who is trying to figure out what role they can play within the scope of diversity and inclusion, I would say be open, be curious, right? Listen, ask questions, and be empathetic. Really try to put yourself in the other person's shoes. And I sort of, I want to go back to something, Gemma, that you said a little earlier in the conversation when you shared some advice from your mother. I'll also share some mom advice. The one of the key principles that she always taught us growing up is to follow the golden rule. And the golden rule basically says, treat others how you want to be treated, period. Yeah. Right. And that, that advice really works whether you're seeking to be an ally or whether, you're an individual that's looking for mentorship and support, right? Treat others how you want to be treated. And I think if we could all do more of that, it just would increase the respect and the trust that we have. And again, our culture would be so much better for it.
I completely agree, Nikki. I think that's fantastic mum advice. I think the interesting thing that made me think too about some of the questions you've asked earlier on, Sam and Amy, is that feeling of inclusion that comes so much from that empathy and understanding. Because if you lead with putting yourself into, if I act like this, would I feel great if this happened to me? That pretty much would take care of most non-inclusive behaviors if you put that stop check in place, because that is the bottom line there, is that inclusion is something that creates a feeling of, as Nikki said earlier, of trust. And if you're pausing to think, would I want to be treated like that, you genuinely will think as an inclusive person, I think.
Absolutely. I think you're halfway there, aren't you? I think it's having that awareness. And I think, as you say, if everyone stopped after every kind of, everything they did almost and thought, actually, would I want to be treated like that? I think, as you say, I think the world would be a very different place. Society would be a very different place.
And almost so by the time you get to the point of asking that question, you probably know that you've said something not quite right as well. Yeah. Because almost like you should know in the moment, right, that you don't even need to ask that. But I think it's such a good reflection point.
It is reflection point. That's it, Ames. And I think something that's always kind of rung true with me, Gemma, it's some advice that you've offered before when people have said, you know, as an ally, what can we do if we hear somebody say something that isn't inclusive, or if we witness an uninclusive behaviour? And I remember you said that one of the things you would do is you would always ask that person to repeat themselves or explain what they mean, not in a confrontational way, but just by doing that, it automatically gets that person thinking about maybe what they've just said. And then probably almost 90%, 95% of the time, people will then start to backtrack, because they'll actually, it's about putting that awareness in there, isn't it? And I think it's such a simple thing, but
it very much is. And I think it's we've talked about it obviously as an organization. We've been talking about inclusive language in particular. You're right.
yes,
and it is the casual microaggressions that people will form at times and assume you think or feel the same thing. That's where that's most effective to highlight that. Oh no, what do you mean by that? Is a way to stop and encourage that pause point. And I think that can be highly effective in the right setting.
Well, and again, coming back to what we were saying earlier, when you have this culture of openness and accountability, right, which are two of our core values, when you actually have that and it's personified, then the leader in the room doesn't necessarily have to call it out every single time. Anyone in the meeting can point it out, right? And I think it's a home run point, Gemma, that we do have to call out those behaviors when they happen, you know, obviously in a respectful way, but we have to constantly push back against uninclusive behaviors and microaggressions and the things that are harmful to individuals.
Absolutely, totally agree. And that's, you know, that's why we are all happy for people to reach out to us. You know, we've all kind of, within the US and BGB, we've got the employee resource group. So please do reach out if you want to kind of know more about what we've been talking about today. I could talk to all three of you forever. I mean, microaggressions could be a whole podcast on its own, couldn't it? Let's be honest.
I think so.
Absolutely.
It absolutely could.
But yeah, I mean, Ames, do you want to? You always ask this question, so fire away to finish us off.
Well, just I guess coming to the end of it, I think it's been so lovely to have you both on. And again, I mean, I think we probably could have spoken for a good couple of days on everything to do with inclusion, which is amazing. But whilst we've got you on the podcast, we just really wanted to hear, what is the best career advice that you've been given to date that you can share with the people listening?
Although after this podcast, I think we should maybe be changing this to, what's the best advice you've had from a parent? Because there's been some great mum advice on this one.
So
I feel like mine happened today from Nikki's mum. So I'm
yeah.
We love moms. We love moms.
We do love moms. Best career advice today. There's so many. Very fortunately, there's so many examples that I could pinpoint. But if I was going to take it back to where I've had the most professional and personal development, it's about never quelling your curiosity to learn. For me, I remember, and it came as advice to me in a negative way, in that I had a job for a leader that was very autocratic and very keeping people in their place, and I asked too many questions, and I was told that I did not need to know that, and that wasn't my place to know it. And I had another leader who pulled me aside after a meeting and said, that is absolutely advice you should never ever take. Be curious every day, and anytime you think you want to know, ask, because that's when you will learn more than everyone else in the room. And that, for me, probably knocks into understanding more about how to be a more inclusive leader, how to be a better person, and how to help educate the generation as a mother now as well. I think being curious and never losing that was probably the best piece of advice. There's many others, but that would stick with me always, and has done.
Love it.
So yeah, what I would say, I mentioned the advice around don't remixing yourself earlier. That one, that stuck with me, throughout my career, and I continue to think about that and follow that. in all facets of my life. But the other great advice that I've received is to be fearless. This idea of being unafraid, to step out and share those ideas, and even if the idea is a bad one, or if it doesn't work, to be fearless and to keep moving forward and fighting to see another day.
Wow. So be curious, be fearless, and don't remix yourself. There you go.
Absolutely.
Wow.
Love
That
it.
was so good. Thank you so much. Honestly,
Yeah.
it's been, I think it's always really hard to narrow it down at the end to your best career advice, because I think you've spent the best part of 35 minutes just giving out non-stop amazing career advice to that point. So honestly, we appreciate you coming on the podcast so much. It was really enjoyable for us and hopefully for everyone listening too. So thank you very much.
Thank
so
you
much.
for
Thank
having
you.
us. When can we do this again?
I know.
Absolutely. I was just going to ask the
definitely.
same. Thank
Tomorrow?
you, Sam and Amy. Thank you, Nikki.
Thank
Oh,
you so
thank
much.
you.
Thanks, everyone. And we will see you for our next podcast.
Thanks.